They said no living thing should have been able to move through that storm. But something was still out there, refusing to stop, refusing to fall. As thunder cracked over the Oregon mountains and rain turned the world into a shifting wall of gray and white. The wind tore across the ridgeline with a force that bent pine trees sideways, and visibility dropped to almost nothing, just fragments of terrain and flashes of lightning revealing a landscape that looked more like a broken world than anything alive. Somewhere in that chaos, a German Shepherd K9 lay half-covered in mud and rainwater, his body trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion and strain, his breathing uneven as he forced himself forward 1 inch at a time, as if every movement was a decision made against impossible odds. His name was Ranger, a rescue K9 attached to the United States Marine Corps, and even injured, even at the edge of his limits, he was still trying to do his job. A low, broken bark escaped him, not loud, not commanding, but persistent, echoing into the storm like a signal that refused to die. Far above the ridge line, the radio tower at base command had already gone silent, the storm too dense, too violent, cutting every channel into static. But Ranger wasn't listening to radios. He was listening to something deeper, something that pulled him forward through instinct alone. Every few seconds, he would stop, lift his head slightly, and turn toward a direction that made no sense to anyone watching from the outside, as if he could see through fog and rock and rain to something hidden beneath the earth itself. And behind him, a faint trail marked where he had come from. Not dramatic, not loud, just the quiet evidence of effort in a place where effort meant survival. Then, cutting through the storm, came the sound of boots. Heavy, controlled, steady even under pressure. Sergeant Daniel Harris moved through the slope with one hand raised to shield his face from the rain, his tactical jacket soaked through, each step calculated to avoid losing traction on the slippery ground. He was a Marine K9 handler, trained for missions where conditions were never ideal, but even he had to pause for a fraction of a second when he saw Ranger ahead. The dog wasn't supposed to be out here like this. He was injured during the earlier sweep, a mission that had gone wrong when the terrain collapsed without warning, separating units and forcing an emergency retreat from the lower valley. Harris had been ordered to return to base with the remaining team, but Ranger had not followed that order. Instead, he had slipped away into the storm as soon as the ground shook again, ignoring every command, every recall signal, every whistle cut short by wind. Now Harris stepped forward slowly, voice tight but controlled, calling out into the rain, but the sound was swallowed before it could travel more than a few feet. "Ranger, hold position," he said again, louder this time, but the dog didn't stop. Instead, Ranger turned his head slightly, just enough for Harris to see his eyes, sharp, focused, and strangely calm despite everything. It wasn't panic that drove him forward, it was certainty. And that certainty made Harris hesitate in a way he rarely allowed himself to. Behind them, somewhere lower on the ridge, a rescue team led by Lieutenant Michael Carter was trying to re-establish formation. Carter was methodical, disciplined, the kind of officer who trusted maps, coordinates, and procedure over instinct. Through the crackle of a partially working comm unit, his voice broke through, demanding confirmation of position and ordering Harris to fall back immediately due to escalating storm conditions. But Harris didn't move, because Ranger had started forward again, slower now, more deliberate, as if each step was chosen with purpose rather than survival alone. The dog moved toward a narrowing section of the ridge where rock and soil had collapsed earlier in the day, forming an unstable path that no rational route map would recommend. Yet Ranger did not hesitate. He stepped carefully, testing ground before committing weight, leading as though he remembered something no human had been told. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the slope ahead, and in that instant Harris saw it too. A faint structural outline partially buried near the base of the incline, too straight to be natural, too deliberate to be chance. Ranger stopped at the edge, his body lowering slightly, not in fear, but in confirmation, as if he had finally arrived at the point he had been searching for all along. The storm continued to rage, but for the first time since it began, there was a sense that something beneath it had been found, something that did not belong to the storm at all, and Harris felt a shift in his chest as he realized that whatever lay ahead was not just part of a rescue route, but something far more uncertain, something that defied every assumption he had made when the mission began just hours earlier. 3 hours earlier, before the storm reached its peak and before the ridge became a maze of collapsing fog and fractured silence, the mission had begun under a sky that still carried the dull gray promise of worsening weather. At Forward Operating Point Echo, the temporary command post sat on a flattened section of mountain road surrounded by dense pine forest, its canvas structures rattling softly under increasing wind. Inside the main briefing shelter, Sergeant Daniel Harris stood beside a folding table covered in terrain maps, digital tablets, and marked coordinates that traced the last known position of a missing civilian hiking group reported by a ranger station 12 miles north of the valley. Lieutenant Michael Carter paced slowly behind him, his posture rigid, his attention divided between the map and the rising tension in the weather report updates coming through a crackling speaker. The forecast had shifted rapidly within the last hour, turning what had been classified as a moderate mountain storm into a severe weather event with unpredictable wind shear and flash flooding risk. Carter was a man who trusted procedure above instinct, and every sentence he spoke reflected that discipline as he emphasized the importance of containment, limited exposure, and immediate extraction if conditions deteriorated beyond safe operational limits. Across from him, Sergeant Harris listened without interruption, but his attention was not on the map alone. Sitting quietly beside him was Ranger, a German Shepherd trained for United States Marine Corps search and rescue operations, his coat damp from earlier exposure, his breathing steady but focused in a way that suggested awareness beyond the room itself. Ranger had sustained an injury during the initial reconnaissance sweep when unstable terrain shifted unexpectedly, forcing the team to retreat and reassess. Yet despite medical evaluation and orders to remain at base, the dog had refused full rest, staying close to Harris as if unwilling to disengage from the mission entirely. As Carter concluded the briefing, Emily Brooks, a field paramedic attached to the rescue unit, entered the shelter with a medical kit secured across her shoulder, her expression calm but alert as she reviewed the updated casualty probability estimates. She glanced at Ranger briefly, noting his posture, the way his ears subtly adjusted to every sound beyond the tent walls, and then she shifted her attention back to the discussion. When the final decision was made to proceed with a limited search team deployment along Ridge Sector 7, Harris was assigned forward lead with Ranger at his side, while Carter maintained command oversight from a secondary position. The order was clear, structured, and designed to minimize risk, but the moment the team stepped outside the shelter, the wind had already begun to change direction in a way that suggested the storm was accelerating faster than predicted. Within minutes of movement through the lower trail system, visibility dropped significantly as moisture thickened in the air and the forest canopy began to sway with increasing force. Ranger moved ahead of the formation in controlled intervals, stopping frequently to reassess direction, his behavior precise, yet increasingly urgent in subtle ways that only Harris seemed to notice. At first, Carter dismissed it as environmental response behavior, a trained K9 adjusting to sensory overload. But Harris observed something different. Ranger was not reacting randomly. He was tracking. The dog's pauses were consistent, his head turns deliberate, and his focus repeatedly returned toward a narrow ridge path that deviated from the planned route. When Harris attempted to guide him back to formation, alignment, Ranger resisted not with aggression, but with firm persistence, planting himself briefly before continuing forward in the alternate direction. The disagreement escalated enough for Carter to call for a temporary halt, his voice cutting through the wind as he demanded confirmation of intent from Harris. Harris hesitated for only a moment before responding that Ranger was indicating something beyond the mapped search perimeter, something not reflected in any satellite overlay or Ranger report. Carter's response was immediate, instructing the team to ignore deviation and proceed according to the original grid pattern, citing safety protocols and time sensitivity. Yet, even as the command was issued, Ranger moved again, this time with greater urgency, pulling slightly ahead until Harris made a decision that broke procedural alignment and followed him off the marked trail. That decision shifted the entire dynamic of the operation. The team adjusted reluctantly, maintaining visual contact but losing formation integrity as terrain grew steeper and the forest began to thin into exposed rock corridors. The wind intensified, carrying the sound of distant pressure shifts through the valley, and communication equipment began to degrade intermittently, producing fragmented transmissions that could no longer guarantee coordination with base. Emily Brooks moved closer to Harris, noting the change in environmental stability and asking for confirmation that they were still within safe operational parameters, but Harris did not immediately answer. His attention was fixed entirely on Ranger, who had now slowed near a natural break in the ridge where rock formations angled downward into a partially concealed depression. The dog's posture changed again, lowering slightly, not from fatigue, but from focused attention, as if confirming presence of something beneath the surface that the human eye had not yet registered. Carter approached from behind, frustration visible in his stance as he prepared to override the deviation order, but before he could speak, a sudden shift in wind exposed a faint structural outline embedded in the slope below, barely visible through rain and mist. Ranger remained motionless at the edge of that discovery point, his gaze unwavering, and for the first time since the mission began, silence overtook the team not because of command, but because of realization that the path they had been following was no longer simply about navigation, but about understanding why the K-9 had led them there in the first place. The silence that followed the discovery on the ridge was not natural silence. It was the kind that arrives when people stop speaking at the same time without agreeing to do so. Wind still moved through the narrow mountain corridor, rain still fell in uneven sheets, and distant thunder still rolled across the valley. But none of it reached the center of attention where Ranger stood motionless at the edge of the partially exposed structure. Sergeant Daniel Harris felt it first, not as thought, but as pressure in the chest, the instinct that something important was no longer hidden in uncertainty. Lieutenant Michael Carter stepped closer with deliberate caution, boots gripping wet stone as he tried to maintain control over the moment, his voice quieter now, but still shaped by authority as he asked for visual confirmation of what the team was seeing. Emily Brooks adjusted her position beside him, lowering slightly to get a clearer view past the uneven rock face, her flashlight beam cutting through rain only to reveal fragments of geometry that did not belong to the natural environment. What emerged from the storm was not a clear structure, but a suggestion of one, reinforced edges beneath soil and stone, lines too straight to be accidental, too consistent to be geological. Ranger did not move. His body remained aligned toward a single point, head slightly lowered, ears fixed forward, as if confirming that the team had finally arrived at the exact place he had been guiding them toward from the beginning of the ascent. Harris slowly approached him, hand extended but not touching, speaking in a calm voice meant to stabilize rather than command. Carter, still skeptical, began referencing mapping data, trying to match coordinates with known terrain records, but the data offered nothing that explained what lay beneath the ridge surface. The storm intensified again, a sudden gust rolling through the canyon and forcing everyone to brace for stability. Yet Ranger remained steady, unaffected by the chaos around him, as if the environment had already been accounted for in his understanding of the situation. Then, a faint metallic sound emerged beneath the wind, not loud, but distinct enough to interrupt the rhythm of rain striking stone. Emily Brooks immediately focused her attention on the source, shifting her light across the exposed edge where soil had been washed away. Harris knelt slightly, brushing away loose debris with careful hands, revealing a fragment of reinforced material that reflected light in a way natural rock never could. Carter's expression shifted for the first time from procedural confidence to uncertainty as he stepped closer and observed the same detail, realizing that this was not part of any documented trail modification or known emergency shelter system. Ranger finally moved, not forward, but sideways, repositioning himself a few feet along the edge and pausing again, indicating a second point of interest that had not yet been examined. The team followed cautiously, each step revealing more of the concealed formation, until the outline suggested something larger beneath the mountain surface, something deliberately placed rather than formed over time. Harris exchanged a brief look with Emily, both recognizing that this discovery did not align with the original mission parameters, yet it also could not be ignored. Carter raised his radio to request satellite cross-verification, but the device responded only with static, confirming that communication degradation had now reached total failure in this sector. For the first time, command structure was no longer operating with external input, leaving the team entirely dependent on immediate observation and judgment. Ranger let out a low, controlled bark, not urgent, but precise, drawing attention to a narrow gap where rock and soil had separated further under storm pressure. Harris moved closer and felt a faint airflow coming from within, subtle but consistent, indicating open space beneath the ridge. Emily adjusted her equipment, preparing for emergency assessment protocols, while Carter stood momentarily still, absorbing the implications of what they had uncovered. The realization began to settle in quietly among the team, not as panic, but as understanding that the terrain itself was concealing something significant, something that required immediate reassessment of the entire operation. Ranger remained at the edge, eyes locked forward, as if waiting for the humans to finally catch up to what he had known long before the storm ever began. The moment the team fully crossed the threshold of uncertainty on the ridge, everything around them felt like it had shifted into a different state of reality, not because the storm had changed, but because their understanding of the ground beneath their feet had begun to collapse into something far more complex than terrain and weather alone. Sergeant Daniel Harris remained closest to Ranger, moving in measured steps along the exposed edge where the soil had been washed away, revealing more of the hidden formation beneath. Each step brought additional clarity, but also more questions, as the structure below the ridge did not resemble any standard emergency shelter, geological formation, or known military installation registered in the region. Lieutenant Michael Carter stood slightly behind, maintaining visual oversight while attempting to reconcile what he was seeing with the official map data still stored in his tablet, though the device continued to fail intermittently under the storm interference. Emily Brooks carefully scanned the exposed surface with her flashlight, tracing along reinforced lines and partial angles that suggested deliberate construction rather than natural erosion, her voice low as she confirmed that the material composition did not match surrounding rock density or soil composition. Ranger remained in position at the edge, unmoving for several seconds, then shifted slightly to the left, drawing attention to a second irregular break in the ground where the slope curved inward in a way that suggested an opening beneath the surface. Harris followed his movement immediately, crouching to get a closer look, brushing away loose debris with careful hands until a narrow gap appeared, just wide enough to allow air to move through from below. The airflow was subtle but undeniable, steady enough to indicate a hollow space beneath the ridge, and the realization caused a shift in the team dynamic from observation to cautious verification. Carter finally lowered his resistance slightly, stepping forward to observe the gap directly. His earlier skepticism replaced with a controlled silence as he processed the implications of a concealed structure existing outside any recorded survey data. Ranger gave a brief, controlled alert sound, not loud enough to signal alarm, but precise enough to indicate confirmation, as if marking that this was the correct location. Harris adjusted his position and extended a handheld light deeper into the gap, revealing what appeared to be an interior edge, possibly a reinforced entry point partially blocked by debris and time. Emily immediately began documenting the find, noting coordinates manually due to continued system failure, while Carter attempted once more to establish communication with Base Command, only to receive uninterrupted static that confirmed total signal loss in this sector. The absence of external communication forced a shift in responsibility entirely onto the field team, making every decision now dependent on direct observation and immediate judgment rather than protocol guidance. The storm above intensified again, sending another wave of wind through the ridge, causing loose debris to shift and briefly widen the visible opening, exposing a deeper shadow beneath the surface that suggested a larger internal space beyond what could be seen from the ridge line. Harris exchanged a brief glance with Emily, both recognizing that what they had uncovered required immediate reassessment of the mission scope, while Carter stood momentarily still, absorbing the fact that their original search parameters no longer applied to the situation unfolding in front of them. Ranger remained focused on the opening, his posture steady and unwavering, as if confirming that the path forward had already been decided long before the humans had arrived at the ridge. And in that moment, the team understood that the storm was no longer just a weather condition surrounding them, but part of a larger unfolding discovery that had only just begun to reveal itself beneath the mountain surface. The decision to move beyond observation and into controlled exploration did not happen with a single command, but rather through a gradual collapse of certainty among the team as the storm above continued to intensify, and the exposed opening beneath the ridge revealed more signs that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Sergeant Daniel Harris remained closest to Ranger, his focus alternating between the dog and the narrow gap in the ground where air continued to flow steadily from below, suggesting a stable void rather than a collapsed cavity. Lieutenant Michael Carter stood slightly back, still attempting to maintain procedural structure, but his posture had shifted from resistance to cautious evaluation as he recognized that standard mapping data could no longer account for what they were observing. Emily Brooks carefully adjusted her position to improve visibility, using her flashlight to trace the interior edge of the opening, confirming that the structural lines beneath the soil extended deeper than initially estimated and followed a consistent geometric pattern inconsistent with natural erosion or rock formation. Ranger moved again, not in urgency, but in precise steps along the edge of the exposed ridge, stopping at a second point where the soil dipped inward more sharply, indicating a potential entry path partially concealed by accumulated debris and sediment. Harris followed immediately, kneeling to clear a small section by hand, revealing a reinforced edge beneath the surface that reflected light differently from surrounding material, confirming human involvement in the structure below. Carter stepped closer at this point, his voice lower than before as he requested another attempt at communication with Base Command. But the radio again produced only static, confirming that the storm had fully disrupted external coordination channels. The absence of communication forced the team into complete field autonomy, increasing both the weight of responsibility and the importance of each observation they made in real time. Emily documented the coordinates manually, noting that the location did not appear on any updated satellite overlays or emergency infrastructure registries, which added further uncertainty to the purpose of the structure beneath them. Ranger suddenly paused and turned his head toward the opening, maintaining stillness for several seconds before issuing a low-controlled alert sound that immediately drew attention back to the central gap. Harris leaned forward and directed his light deeper into the space, revealing a faint downward slope that suggested the structure extended further underground than previously assumed, with layered surfaces indicating deliberate construction rather than accidental formation. Carter finally acknowledged the significance of the discovery, his stance shifting from directive authority to investigative caution as he assessed the implications of an unregistered subterranean structure existing within an active search zone. The storm above continued to push through the ridge, causing intermittent shifts in debris that occasionally widened the visible opening, exposing deeper interior shadows that hinted at multiple connected chambers or passages below the surface. Harris felt a growing sense of alignment between Ranger's movements and the revealed structure, as if every decision the dog had made leading up to this point was connected to a precise understanding of what lay beneath the mountain. Emily confirmed that airflow from the opening remained steady and directional, indicating a maintained internal environment rather than a sealed collapse, which further increased the complexity of the situation. Carter lowered his tablet slightly, no longer relying on it for validation, and instead focused entirely on direct observation as the team collectively recognized that their mission parameters had shifted from external search and rescue to controlled investigation of an unknown underground system. Ranger held his position at the edge, calm and focused, as if awaiting the next human decision while maintaining unwavering certainty in the path he had already identified. And in that shared silence, the team understood they were no longer following a mapped operation but entering a discovery that none of their training had fully prepared them to interpret. The moment the team accepted that they were dealing with something beyond mapped terrain and beyond any standard emergency structure, the storm above them seemed to respond, as if acknowledging their shift in understanding, tightening its pressure across the ridge and forcing every movement into slower, more deliberate action. Sergeant Daniel Harris remained closest to Ranger, who still stood at the edge of the exposed opening with unwavering focus, his body angled toward the descending gap beneath the ridge, as if he could perceive depth that the human eye had not yet fully processed. Lieutenant Michael Carter held position slightly uphill, maintaining visual oversight while adjusting his stance to account for unstable footing caused by shifting soil and intermittent runoff. His earlier reliance on procedural certainty now replaced with cautious adaptation to rapidly changing field conditions. Emily Brooks moved carefully along the exposed edge, confirming that the airflow from below remained consistent and directional, indicating a sustained internal space rather than a collapsed void. And this detail alone altered the operational understanding of the entire situation from surface search to subterranean assessment. Harris slowly extended a portable illumination device toward the opening, angling the light downward in controlled increments until the beam revealed a gradual slope leading deeper beneath the ridge line, confirming that the structure extended well beyond the initial breach point. Carter observed in silence for several seconds before attempting once again to establish communication with Base Command, but the device returned only persistent static, confirming that atmospheric interference had now fully compromised external coordination systems in this sector. The absence of communication reinforced the necessity for field-driven decision-making, placing full responsibility on immediate human observation and judgment. Without external validation, Ranger shifted slightly, not away from the opening but along its perimeter, stopping at a new point where the soil had separated further due to erosion and storm impact, revealing another segment of reinforced material consistent with engineered construction rather than natural geological layering. Harris followed this movement, carefully removing loose debris by hand to expose a clearer section of the structure, noting that the material surface displayed uniform alignment and depth consistency, suggesting deliberate design and long-term stability beneath the mountain surface. Emily documented these findings manually, marking precise coordinates and environmental conditions, noting that no known infrastructure records or emergency system registries accounted for any structure in this location. Carter lowered his equipment slightly and stepped closer, his expression shifting from analytical resistance to focused concern as he processed the implications of an unregistered subterranean system existing directly beneath an active rescue zone. Ranger issued a brief, controlled alert sound, drawing immediate attention back to the central opening, and Harris responded by directing illumination further into the descending space, where the slope transitioned into a more defined corridor-like formation, suggesting intentional access rather than accidental collapse. The visual confirmation of structured depth beneath the ridge introduced a new operational variable, indicating that the team was no longer observing surface anomaly, but potentially a multi-level underground system with unknown purpose and unknown extent. Carter paused again, recalibrating his assessment as he recognized that standard search and rescue frameworks could not fully account for the complexity of what they were now observing, and he instructed the team to maintain position while he evaluated next steps under degraded communication conditions. Harris remained focused on Ranger, whose posture remained steady and composed, positioned precisely at the threshold as if continuing to indicate the correct path forward without hesitation or deviation. Emily noted that environmental readings remained stable despite external storm escalation, further reinforcing the unusual separation between surface weather intensity and subsurface environmental consistency. As the team stood at the edge of the opening, the combination of structural evidence, sustained airflow, and Ranger's unwavering guidance created a unified realization that they were no longer responding to a conventional rescue scenario, but standing at the entrance of something intentionally concealed beneath the mountain, awaiting the next decision that would determine how deeply they would proceed into the unknown. The decision to proceed deeper into the underground structure did not come from a single order, but from a shared understanding that the situation had moved beyond observation and into controlled exploration, where hesitation itself could limit the ability to understand what lay beneath the ridge. Sergeant Daniel Harris led the movement first, stepping carefully down the sloped entry path with controlled balance, his flashlight angled forward to maintain visibility along the descending corridor that now clearly extended beneath the mountain surface. Lieutenant Michael Carter followed at a measured distance, maintaining tactical spacing while continuing to monitor environmental stability and team positioning. His earlier procedural rigidity now softened into adaptive caution as the reality of the structure demanded flexibility beyond standard protocol. Emily Brooks moved last in the immediate sequence, ensuring that environmental readings and visual documentation were continuously recorded despite intermittent equipment interference caused by residual storm activity above the ridge. Ranger remained at the front of the formation, leading without hesitation, his pace slow but consistent as he guided the team deeper into the engineered passage, pausing only when necessary to confirm direction before continuing forward. The interior space revealed itself gradually through shifting light and shadow, showing reinforced surfaces along the walls that indicated deliberate construction designed for structural endurance rather than temporary shelter, and the deeper they advanced, the more the environment appeared insulated from the storm conditions above. Harris maintained steady observation of Ranger's behavior, noting that the K-9 was not reacting with uncertainty or caution, but with deliberate confidence, as if recognizing a familiar route rather than discovering it for the first time. Carter quietly acknowledged this pattern as well, though he remained focused on maintaining operational awareness and ensuring that the team did not exceed safe exploratory depth without external support confirmation. As they progressed further, the corridor widened slightly, revealing branching formations that suggested a networked layout rather than a single linear passage, increasing the complexity of interpretation for both structural purpose and origin. Emily paused briefly to examine surface markings along one section of the wall, noting faint irregularities that could indicate either long-term environmental interaction or intentional design features now partially obscured by time and sediment. Harris directed his light along the same area, confirming that the material composition remained consistent throughout, reinforcing the conclusion that the structure was unified in design rather than assembled in phases. Ranger stopped at a junction point where the corridor divided into two distinct paths, one continuing downward at a gradual angle and the other extending horizontally into darkness, and he remained fixed at this position for several seconds without movement, as if assessing direction with certainty beyond visual input. Carter approached slowly, observing both pathways while attempting to correlate their orientation with known geological mapping, but found no corresponding reference points within the available data. The absence of matching records reinforced the understanding that this structure had not been documented in any public or operational archive accessible to the team. Harris lowered his light briefly to check Ranger's posture, noting that the K-9 remained focused on the horizontal passage, his body angled slightly in that direction with steady attention that suggested intentional selection rather than random movement. Emily confirmed that airflow patterns within the junction remained stable across both paths, indicating that neither route was structurally compromised, further complicating the decision of which direction to prioritize. Carter requested a temporary pause in movement to reassess strategy, but even as he spoke, Ranger took a single step forward into the horizontal passage and then stopped, maintaining position as if signaling readiness without forcing immediate compliance. The team observed this behavior in silence, recognizing that the dog's actions continued to align with consistent directional intent rather than exploratory randomness. Harris finally acknowledged the significance of the moment, understanding that Ranger was not reacting to the environment but navigating it with purpose that had already been established before the team entered the structure. As the light from the surface storm faded behind them and the underground corridor absorbed their presence more completely, the team stood at the branching point with a shared awareness that every decision from this moment forward would determine how far they would follow the path that had been silently chosen long before they ever reached the ridge. As the team committed to the horizontal passage, leaving the branching junction behind, the environment within the underground structure began to change in subtle but measurable ways that immediately distinguished it from the unstable storm conditions above the ridge. The air grew more controlled, less turbulent, as if the space had been insulated from external weather influence for an extended period of time. Sergeant Daniel Harris led the movement forward with steady pacing, keeping his flashlight aligned with the center of the passage while carefully scanning for structural irregularities that might indicate instability or collapse risk. Lieutenant Michael Carter followed at a measured distance, maintaining awareness of both forward progression and rear positioning, his attention now divided between operational safety and the growing uncertainty surrounding the purpose of the structure itself. Emily Brooks continued to document environmental readings, noting that humidity levels were stable and airflow remained consistent, suggesting an engineered ventilation system rather than natural air seepage through rock formations. Ranger remained at the front, moving with calm precision, his steps unhurried but deliberate, as if he were following a path that had been established long before the team entered the underground system. As they advanced deeper, the corridor began to widen again, revealing smoother wall surfaces with more defined structural alignment, reinforcing the conclusion that this was not a natural cave system, but a constructed network designed with intentional architecture. Harris briefly paused to examine a section of the wall where faint linear markings appeared, partially obscured by dust and time, suggesting either maintenance activity long past or structural coating that had since degraded beyond recognition. Carter requested a status check from Emily, who confirmed that no seismic instability was detected, further reducing the likelihood of imminent collapse while increasing the mystery of how such a structure had remained undiscovered beneath an active mountainous region. Ranger suddenly slowed, then stopped completely, directing his attention toward a darker segment of the passage ahead, where visibility diminished beyond the reach of their current lighting equipment. Harris adjusted his position and directed additional illumination forward, revealing the faint outline of a reinforced doorway or access point embedded within the corridor wall, partially sealed but structurally intact. The discovery immediately shifted the team's focus from exploration to controlled assessment, as Carter moved closer to evaluate the structure while maintaining procedural caution despite the lack of external communication. Emily confirmed that airflow near this section intensified slightly, indicating a possible connection to a larger internal chamber beyond the sealed point. Ranger remained positioned directly in front of the access point, unmoving, his posture steady and attentive, as if confirming that this was the intended destination all along. Harris carefully examined the perimeter of the structure, noting that the material composition differed slightly from the surrounding walls, suggesting reinforcement or later modification. Carter raised his hand to signal a temporary halt, instructing the team to avoid forcing entry until full assessment could be completed. But even as he spoke, it became clear that the structure itself did not appear compromised or unstable, only intentionally closed. The silence within the corridor deepened as the team collectively focused on the sealed access point, each member processing the implication that this underground system had been deliberately constructed and maintained, yet left unrecorded and unexplained in any accessible documentation. Ranger shifted only slightly, maintaining proximity to the sealed point, his presence reinforcing a sense of directional certainty that contrasted with the human uncertainty surrounding the structure's origin and purpose. As Harris stood beside him, he realized that every movement the K-9 had made since entering the storm had been guiding them toward this exact location, not through randomness or reaction, but through a consistent and purposeful understanding that none of them could yet fully explain. The moment the decision was made to proceed with controlled access, the underground corridor seemed to hold its breath, as if the structure itself was waiting for the next human action to confirm what the German shepherd had already understood long before the team arrived. Sergeant Daniel Harris positioned himself directly beside the sealed access point, carefully inspecting the reinforced frame, while Lieutenant Michael Carter oversaw the operation with cautious authority, now fully aware that procedural control mattered less than structural integrity and environmental safety. Emily Brooks maintained her documentation stance slightly behind them, monitoring airflow, humidity, and structural response, confirming once again that the interior environment remained stable and isolated from the storm conditions above the ridge. Ranger stood closest to the sealed entry, unmoving, his focus locked forward with a calm intensity that did not shift even as Harris ran his hand along the edge of the structure, identifying a manual release mechanism partially concealed beneath accumulated dust and time. Carter signaled for controlled access procedures, instructing the team to proceed slowly and maintain situational awareness, though his voice now carried less authority and more acknowledgement that they were entering unknown territory that no standard training fully accounted for. Harris applied steady pressure to the release point, and after a brief moment of resistance, the mechanism engaged with a soft structural release that echoed faintly through the corridor, followed by a controlled separation of the reinforced panel. There was no collapse, no instability, only a slow reveal of space that had remained untouched for an extended period of time. As the panel opened further, a dim but steady internal lighting system activated automatically, suggesting an emergency or preservation infrastructure still functional despite isolation from external systems. The team paused at the threshold, allowing their eyes to adjust as the interior chamber gradually came into view, revealing a maintained underground facility with structured corridors, reinforced walls, and operational lighting lines that extended deeper into the complex. Emily confirmed that oxygen levels remained stable and within safe operational range, further indicating that the system had been designed for sustained occupancy rather than temporary shelter. Carter stepped forward cautiously, scanning the environment with controlled attention, while Harris remained close to Ranger, who had already begun moving forward into the opening without hesitation, as if confirming that this was the final destination he had been guiding them toward from the very beginning of the mission. Inside the chamber, the team discovered organized sections that resembled a long-abandoned but preserved emergency refuge, complete with supply storage areas, mapping stations, and communication equipment that had long since lost connection to external networks but remained structurally intact. As they advanced deeper, subtle signs of human presence became visible, not as recent activity but as remnants of sustained occupation, including neatly arranged equipment and preserved documentation sealed within protective storage units. Emily moved carefully toward one of the central tables, confirming that the materials present were historical in nature rather than active operational systems, suggesting the facility had been constructed for long-term emergency habitation or classified research purposes. Carter reviewed the layout with increasing understanding, recognizing that the structure appeared to be part of a legacy underground system not included in any modern operational registry, likely decommissioned or classified decades earlier. Harris observed Ranger closely, noting that the K-9 had slowed but not stopped, maintaining a steady forward direction toward the central chamber where a reinforced transparent partition revealed an inner safe zone beyond. As the team approached, automatic environmental systems adjusted subtly, stabilizing temperature and air circulation within the chamber, reinforcing the sense that the facility was still partially responsive despite long isolation. Behind the partition, faint movement became visible, and the team immediately shifted focus, only to discover that the movement belonged not to threat or danger, but to a small group of civilians who appeared disoriented but physically stable, seated within a preserved emergency containment section that had remained sealed and protected. Emily immediately assessed their condition from a safe distance, confirming that they showed signs of prolonged sheltering rather than immediate distress, while Carter initiated calm communication attempts to establish trust and orientation. Harris remained beside Ranger, who had finally come to a complete stop, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if confirming that the outcome he had been leading them toward was now fully realized. In that quiet moment within the underground facility, far beneath the storm and hidden ridge above, the team understood that what began as a search through violent weather had become a guided discovery of preserved human life, and that every step taken by the injured K-9 had not only led them to an unknown structure, but directly to the place where survival had quietly endured beyond the reach of time and storm.